Understanding diminished chords and harmony can be a great tool for any musician, and especially for songwriters and improvisers. So if you've ever had trouble getting a grasp on diminished harmony, this is the video for you. I've divided this video into a couple sections so you can skip around if there's some concepts you're already familiar with, but I recommend sticking around for the whole thing because the whole video should be useful for anyone. Now, the easiest place to start if you know nothing about diminished chords is simply figuring out how to play one. Just like all the other chords you know, diminished chords in their simplest form are triads, meaning they have 3 notes. If you're at the piano and you want to play a diminished chord, you'll start with the root, in this case I'll use D, then count 3 half steps up, which now gives us F as our third, then count up another 3 half steps to the 5th, A flat, and you're done. You now have a D diminished triad. This might sound a bit unresolved on its own, but that's really the point of these chords. They're usually meant to create tension before arriving somewhere. Part of the reason these chords sound so tense is because of the interval between the root and the 5th, which is called a tritone. This interval, which has a distance of 6 half steps, is one of the most dissonant intervals in Western music. Major and minor chords don't contain this interval, and instead they have a perfect 5th between their root and 5th, which produces a much more pure sound. The tritone interval appears in the diminished triad because diminished chords are simply created by stacking this interval, which we call a minor third. Knowing this, it's easy to understand how we would get a diminished 7 chord. We would just stack one more minor third, and in this case, we get B, which we should technically be calling C flat to keep with the idea of stacking thirds rather than having a second interval in there. This way, it looks a bit cleaner when we write it in sheet music. Though there are varying opinions on whether we should respell notes like this, especially when we get into the territory of double flats and double sharps, which can be really confusing for beginners. But whatever way you write it, the diminished chord ends up sounding like this. At least to my ear, this feels even more tense than the diminished triad. This is in part because we actually just created another tritone interval between the F and the C flat, and so now we have 2 tritones being played on top of each other. This is why diminished chords are so crunchy, and it's why we often use them dominantly in traditional harmony. This means that they create tension, which needs to be released by arriving at the tonic or a tonic functioning chord. You're probably familiar with the fact that dominant 7 chords also have a dominant function, obviously. And that's what makes the classic 5-to-1 progression so important in music. If I were to be playing in E flat major, my dominant 5-7 chord would be B flat 7. But what would my dominant functioning diminished chord be? Well, diminished chords like to resolve their root a half step up. So in the key of E flat, a D diminished chord would be that chord, since its root is a half step below our tonic, E flat. This means that the dominant functioning diminished chords in major keys and in harmonic minor keys are the 7 chords, meaning they're chords built from the 7th scale degree. And we write it with Roman numerals like this. Using one of these diminished chords in practice might sound something like this. If we take this cadence and look at what's going on, you can see that there are 2 very important resolutions happening. First, the root of the diminished chord moves up to the tonic, as we just talked about. But also, the 5th of the diminished chord moves down to the 3rd scale degree of the key that we're in. In other words, D becomes E flat and A flat becomes G. And these half-step movements are crucial in understanding just how similar diminished chords are to 5-7 chords, because this same resolution happens in a 5-7-to-1 progression. And if we were to make this a diminished 7 chord, it bears the same type of resemblance to a 5-7 flat 9 chord. Here's a short passage I wrote that demonstrates what the resolutions of different diminished chords sound like. Now that we know diminished chords function dominantly, another great way we can start using them is as secondary dominants. Subscribers to the channel might know I have a video covering secondary dominants, linked in the description for any newcomers. But in that video, I neglected to mention that diminished chords can also be used as secondary dominants. And this is a very common technique. For the sake of saving time, I won't go over exactly what a secondary dominant is, feel free to go watch the video, but you can basically think of it as a dominant chord from a different key than the one you're in. Secondary dominants allow us to temporarily feel as though we've entered a different key without actually leaving the home key. This is usually done using the 5 chord from another key, but since the 7 diminished chord that we just talked about serves the same dominant function, we can experiment with using that instead. One example of this that I often see in major keys is the 7 diminished of 2. This means we're taking the chord that's built from the 2nd scale degree of our key and temporarily treating it as if it's the tonic. If this doesn't make sense, say we're in G major and we want to get to our 2 chord A minor. We could just go straight there, but that sounds kind of boring in a progression. Adding a diminished secondary dominant would mean putting the 7 diminished of A minor right before we land on it, and that would sound like this. This G-sharp diminished 7 chord that we added isn't in the key of G major, but it is in A minor, so we can get away with using it briefly to transition to A minor. As I mentioned in the secondary dominance video, this technique truly does appear in all styles. Here's Alicia Keys doing it.
People live for the power, yeah.
Here's Ravel doing it. And there are countless jazz standards that utilize this. Before we continue, I'd just like to mention that all of the gear and software I use to produce these videos, as well as some of the educational resources, will be linked below in the description. Some of these links will earn me a small affiliate commission, so if you're interested in any of the products and planning on getting them anyways, a great way to support the channel and keep videos like this coming is to buy through these links. Another great and completely free way to support the channel is to simply like and subscribe. Thank you. As we dive deeper into the world of diminished chords and their application in more complex ways, the path kind of splits into two, jazz and classical. Now, there are tons of similarities in how diminished chords are used in both genres, but the added dimension of improvisation in jazz really does lend itself to a different set of challenges and considerations. For this reason, I'll start with the classical side of this, which has always struck me personally as a bit simpler, and then move into jazz and talk about when you can throw diminished harmony into your improv, as well as what scales can be used over them. This marks the point in the video where it gets a bit more technical, and I assume you know all the basics once we start talking about some of these concepts. But without further ado, let's jump into some of the unique ways that diminished chords are used in classical music. What we first have to take into consideration is just how prevalent modulation is in classical music, especially in the Romantic period and beyond. Particularly in late Romanticism, modulating to new keys was commonplace. Even in the classical period, things like the introduction of sonata form made modulation a big factor in tons of pieces, even if that modulation was just to closely related keys. Either way, composers needed a way to smoothly transition from key to key, and one of the best chords to use to pivot to a new key is a diminished 7 chord. Since diminished 7 chords have this intervallic symmetry with all minor thirds, you can't really invert them in the traditional sense. If you try to put this D diminished 7 chord in first inversion by changing the bass note to F, what you've done is just created an F diminished 7 chord instead, because all the intervals have stayed the same. Outside of the context of a key center, there's not really a way to know if a diminished 7 chord is inverted or not. And this means that every note in the diminished 7 chord could be treated as a leading tone into a new key. For example, with our D diminished 7 chord, if we treat D as the root, then yeah, we have the main two options of E flat major and E flat minor. But if we treat F as the root, even though all the notes of the chord have stayed the same, we could use this to modulate to G flat major or G flat minor. The case is the same if we treat A flat as the root, which means we could resolve to A major or A minor, and it's the same if we treat C flat as the root, which could resolve to C major or C minor. This means that this single diminished chord, depending on how we characterize it, can actually bring us to 8 different keys, 4 major and 4 minor. This truly opens so many possibilities for modulation because this diminished chord will sound just as good resolving to any of these keys, and so it really is the ultimate pivot chord. I could get from C minor to G flat major easily and naturally just by doing something like this. And while it doesn't sound perfect in this example, there's plenty of examples of composers doing this masterfully. Noticing this about diminished 7 chords can really help open doors to other tonalities. Another technique that's often used in the classical context as well as the modern context is called the common tone diminished chord. A common tone diminished chord is basically a diminished version of your target chord that you play right before landing on your target chord. So if your target chord was an A flat major, you would play an A flat diminished chord to approach it. This works because the third and the fifth of the diminished chord leads stepwise right into the third and fifth of the major chord, while the A flat remains the common tone between the two chords. This is a classic sound on a lot of Disney songs. And another place I've found this technique a lot is in the music of composer Richard Strauss. Here's an excerpt from Strauss's tone poem Death and Transfiguration, along with a MIDI mock-up and score. As for all these examples with sheet music, I encourage you guys to pause and read the music to see what's happening in tandem with the analysis. Strauss goes from this A-flat diminished 7 chord to this A-flat major chord. This works because the A-flat diminished 7 chord contains leading tones that bring us into the third and the fifth of our major chord, while still maintaining that common tone as the tonic. Though this is dominant functioning in the sense that it builds tension and releases it, it has a different sound than the typical 5-to-1 resolution. You can also see he turns this D flat minor 6 over A flat chord into a D flat diminished 7 over A flat chord. And so as you can see, he's using the diminished harmony everywhere, and so there's a lot to analyze that I can't go over in this video. But just know that putting a diminished version of your target chord before your target chord can be a really great sound in the right setting, and it's definitely worth experimenting with. Finally, when it comes to classical music, diminished chords can be used in a more non-functional way that serves to just increase tension or give a sense of tonal ambiguity. One of my favorite examples of this is Bela Bartok's opening to his funeral march of his 4 orchestral pieces. He kind of just flashes 2 diminished chords at us with no clear function. Bartok lands on this big F-sharp diminished chord twice, with no resolution to follow it. The piece is in C-sharp minor, and so this chord really doesn't make total sense in this context, especially because it doesn't resolve to C-sharp minor or anything near it. Instead, Bartok just lets us feel the diminished chord ring out among the orchestra. In addition to this, the intense orchestration aids this unsettling harmony. I'm sure there are tons of examples of this kind of thing going on with diminished chords in modern classical music, but I'm not a huge fan of contemporary classical, and so I can't provide any examples. I'm sure the comments section can help me out on this one. Anyways, now, jazz. The harmonic complexity of jazz music lends itself to many uses for diminished chords, some of which I'm probably not aware, so you'll have to correct me in the comments if I miss anything here. Broadly speaking though, diminished chords will still generally function dominantly. So you can, as we explored earlier, use them in place of dominant 7 flat 9 chords, use them as secondary dominants, etc., etc. But there's an inevitable question that always comes with every chord type in jazz, and that is, what scale should I play over it? Now, the truth is that there's no single correct scale to play over a diminished or diminished 7 chord, but rather a few good options to consider when you're deciding what to play when one pops up. Now, the textbook answer to this question is the diminished scale, which is also called the octatonic scale. For those who are unfamiliar with the diminished scale, here's how it works. The pattern of the scale is alternating, either from half step to whole step or whole step to half step. For now, we'll focus on the whole half variety, since this is usually the scale you want to play over a diminished 7 chord. So for example, if you saw a C diminished 7 chord in your chord chart, you'd want to use the whole half C diminished scale over it. The notes of the scale would be C, D, E flat, F, G flat, A flat, A, and B. This is a reliable and go-to scale for a lot of jazz musicians when they come across a diminished 7 chord. The cool thing about the diminished scale is that it's symmetrical, just like diminished chords themselves. Since the scale has 8 notes, and the intervallic relationships are alternating, it can be transposed in minor thirds without having any of its notes changed, just like we saw earlier with the diminished 7 chords. If I played that whole half diminished scale starting on E flat, a minor third away from C, I'd end up with all the same notes as the whole half C diminished scale we just played. As a result, there really are only 3 octatonic scales, and this makes them a bit easier to get the hang of and apply. Of course, scales are just guidelines, and robotically placing this scale or any other scale in your improvisations won't magically make it sound good. Improvisation is its own art form that goes far beyond the scope of this video, so take any of my advice with a grain of salt. That being said, another way to go about playing over a diminished 7 chord is to take advantage of the fact that they're so similar to 5/7 flat 9 chords. Let's say we're in the key of G major and there's a D7 on the lead sheet. The classic scale to play over this would be the D Mixolydian scale, since that's the 5th mode of G major. But if there's a D7 flat 9 on the lead sheet, playing D Mixolydian might cause the E flat in the chord to clash with the E natural in the scale. For this reason, we have what we call the Mixolydian flat 9 or Mixolydian flat 2 scale, which will fit much better with the dominant 7 flat 9 chord. And since diminished 7 chords are so similar to dominant 7 flat 9 chords, this is one great scale option to play over a diminished 7 chord. The hard part about this is figuring out on the spot which Mixolydian flat 9 scale to play upon seeing a diminished chord in the chart. For example, F sharp diminished 7 is contained within D7 flat 9, but it's also contained within B7 flat 9, A flat 7 flat 9, and F7 flat 9. So it can be a bit tricky to, on the spot, try to figure out the context of this diminished 7 chord that you're looking at. For this reason, I would mostly stick with the octatonic scale when I see a diminished 7 chord on the lead sheet. But if you can make the Mixolydian flat 9 scale work, it has a very cool sound. And in case you need to know, the pattern for the Mixolydian flat 9 scale is half step, minor third, half step, whole step, half step, and whole step. But I recommend just conceptualizing it as what it is, a Mixolydian scale with a flat 9. That works better for my brain at least. Anyways, both of these scales have the potential to be good options for improvising over a diminished 7 chord. As always though, continue to experiment and don't be afraid of doing something that's not theoretically proper. I'm certainly not the be-all end-all of music theory, so continue to study and try out different techniques. Both jazz and classical are full of chromaticism that sometimes just doesn't make technical sense, and instead is the result of creativity and well-trained ears. Improving your ear is really an important part of becoming a musician, and these videos teaching you how chords and scales work in theory can only do so much. Knowing how and where to apply them is not an exact science, and so I recommend listening to as much music as you can from as many different styles as you can so you can develop your own musical landscape. As always, thank you guys so much for sticking to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed and learned something. I had initially planned to make this video about diminished and half diminished chords, but I noticed while writing the script that diminished chords would need their own video. So next up for the channel is, as promised, a video on half diminished chords. Not sure exactly when it'll be ready, but it is coming. But other than that, leave any suggestions you have for future videos down in the comments. Thanks again, leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and keep making music.